Hi, welcome to the second edition of your video blog update from Geneva, Switzerland. I'm Kirsten Blume, Program on Human Rights and the Global Economy Fellow at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, reporting to you on the UN happenings in Geneva this week and my advocacy efforts on behalf of the Law Center around the issue of the criminalization of homelessness as it violates international law. So yesterday I brought you updates from the opening of the 109th session of the Human Rights Committee, and I mentioned meetings I'll have this week with various UN Special Rapporteurs and human rights officers. The last 2 days have been jam-packed, and I'm happy to bring you updates of what's been going on in those meetings and hopes we have for what can come from them. So Wednesday I had the privilege to meet with the human rights officer Madoka Saji, who works for the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to safe water and sanitation. Next year, the Special Rapporteur will publish a handbook for realizing the right to water and sanitation. And we at the Law Center will work with the Rapporteur to suggest language around the criminalization of homelessness, for instance, arrests or citations related to human behaviors such as drinking water or going to the bathroom in public when there's no alternatives that currently exist. And based on this point, we'll emphasize how vital the access to water and sanitation are to combating criminalization approaches. Later that afternoon, I had the opportunity to meet with the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Magdalena Sepulveda. The Special Rapporteur shared with me how important she sees the issue of criminalization as it applies both domestically to the US and to numerous countries throughout the world who have seen an increase in police action in response to homelessness and poverty. In 2011, she published a report on the topic of the trend towards criminalization worldwide called The Penalization of Poverty. We also discussed the process her office uses when they receive complaints from citizens in various countries, and I found this really fascinating. So for instance, if she were to receive a complaint by a homeless person in Seattle, Washington, who's experiencing discrimination by law enforcement there, she'd receive the complaint from the person, respond with a private letter of allegation to the U.S. government, and then the U.S. government in turn would be required to locally investigate the incident. And if there's not a response from the U.S. government within 60 days, the rapporteur could release a public statement to raise awareness of the issue. This is a really important advocacy mechanism that could be used around the world. And it was a privilege to meet with Magdalena and learn about her work and especially how she's prioritizing the issue of criminalization. Later that evening, I attended the book launch for the third edition of the textbook called The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Cases, Materials, and Commentary. The second edition came out 10 years ago, and this third edition update includes hundreds of new cases that the Human Rights Committee has covered in the last 10 years, as well as descriptions of their relevance to international law. So it was a really great opportunity to meet committee members and some really great people working in international law advocacy work. Then earlier this morning, I met with Ulrich Hallstein, the Human Rights Officer for the Special Rapporteur on Food, to discuss the increasingly important issue of people and groups, such as groups like Food Not Bombs and various religious organizations that are being penalized and roadblocked by local police for sharing food with people experiencing homelessness. So Ulrich took interest in the topic as it directly aligns with issues of food access and justice that the Special Rapporteur addresses. And we hope to work together with the mandate in the future around the increasingly relevant advocacy issue. Finally, we at the Law Center recently learned of the advocacy efforts by fellow human rights defenders in Durban, South Africa, who are working to fight forced evictions and destruction of property of people living in shack communities in Durban. In the last year, violence has escalated in Durban as advocates and protesters have rallied against the governmentally backed forced evictions, and police enforcement has responded to these public protests with increasing violence. The advocates in South Africa sent us copies of letters and petitions produced by residents of the settlement, various churches, and numerous international NGOs. And this afternoon I had the chance to deliver those letters and petitions on their behalf to the Office of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders in hopes that the situation will begin to be monitored and create a response from the UN. Overall, it's been a really busy 2 days advocating to special rapporteurs on various issues related to criminalization, and raising the issue of forced evictions. I continue to learn the vital ways that advocates can support the work of the UN Special Rapporteurs and use treaty review mechanisms to address human rights violations both at home in the US and around the world. So it's been a privilege to give you a little update, and thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for another update and more about what's been going on this week tomorrow.